Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Well, it is a sweet gift to be with a brilliant, truly imaginative author who also happens to be a dear friend whom I don't see often enough. Blaine Hogan, dear friend, it is so good to be with you.
Hi, Dan. It's so good to be with you. I only needed to write a book about you.
Okay. Before we, let's not go there quite yet, because we will come back to that. But let's just be very, very clear. You are a deeply creative presence of the creative and creator. And in that sense of, we're going to be talking today about creativity. And also what gets in the way of creativity and how creativity can truly come into a kind of flourishing to be able to reveal something about what it means to live well. So, but we also know, I know, that on, at least according to Amazon, that November 8th of this lovely year, a new book from you is coming out, a new book called Exit the Cave, Embracing a Life of Courage, Creativity, and Radical Imagination. So, folks, I have had the pleasure of reading this book and being able to endorse it. And it is a life-transforming memoir. Invitation to creativity and to engagement with our story. All that to begin by saying, did you ever think of yourself as in the linkage of Augustine? You know, Augustine's the first memoirist. Never, at least in the history of humanity, had a book been published comparable to the Confessions of Augustine or Augustine, depending on how you say his last name. But I would say, and this will maybe for some sound ridiculous, I love Augustine's work, but there's a sense in which I would have loved for him to have read your book and then to have asked the question, how can I tell more truth? How can I embed my own story and the story of the gospel with even greater life and clarity? I can personally wish that your book will become a classic, as in Augustine's Confessions.
Well, that is a very high praise, Dan. I mean, the book is indeed that. It is a confession. in so many ways, I keep, every time I get on an interview, I keep going, why did I do this? Why did I tell these secrets and these stories? And then why do I keep asking people to buy it and go get it? The book, you call it a memoir. I didn't intend to write a memoir. I intended to write a book about the creative process. I set out to expand a self-published work that I had done a long time ago called Untitled, where I was going to sort of unpack in a deeper way the kind of tips and tricks of being a creative professional, having been an actor and a director, now a full-time filmmaker. But as I sat down to write that book, I knew I was going to tell part of my story. I knew that was going to be kind of woven throughout it. But I think I thought I was supposed to write one kind of book. And every time I sat down to write that book, the book I had sold, the book that I'd been given a contract for, I couldn't get there. And so, I did the thing that, really mature creative professionals do, which is ignore emails from their publisher and their agent.
Yes.
For about a year or more. until eventually my agent had me join a meeting, which I later realized was an intervention with a writing coach. And he suggested, he introduced me to this woman who I didn't know was going to be on the call, named Meredith, and introduced her as a writing coach. And I was like, oh boy.
That's not a good note.
That's right. And he in just a really gentle way was like, I wanted you to meet Meredith. I think she might be helpful to you. And I said, yeah, I think it actually, I was ready for recovery. I was ready to enter into the process. And so she gave me some really great advice, and it was throw out everything that you sold to the publisher, throw out every idea that you've had, throw out the idea of the book that you're supposed to write, and just start writing your story, which to me felt like the most comfortable place to be. I never viewed myself as a teacher. And that was sort of the book I thought I was going to write about. I was going to teach about the creative process. I was going to tell it. And instead I needed to do, like I said, just what felt the most comfortable, which was to show, not tell, and do that through the lens of my story. And I guess a memoir is what came out of it. It is so amazing to have this conversation because in my hero's journey, Dan, and I do hope people will read the book, but you are my guide. You're the crazy, wild-haired professor that I meet in the kind of immediately following my inciting incident that begins to open up a world that I didn't think was possible. And it turns out that was the creative process that I was meant to talk about, that it wasn't a creative process with regard to a project unless the project was, or rather, it wasn't about the creative process with regard to a project, except that I realized that the project was my actual life.
Yeah. And I deferred at the beginning. I'll just say the intersection in being in your book was a read that was both revelatory to me and had so much honor. I indeed, as I have said to you, felt so honored, but also so exposed, and the blush that may have been there in the beginning. As my wife said, I don't see you blush often. I'm grateful you have the capacity. But when you were reading this book, I almost could tell the particular sections on the basis of the reddening of your face. So, of course, to be...
Do you remember, Dan, do you remember what made you blush? I mean, I hold that as a high honor. I don't think many people make you blush, but I feel like I do need to put you on the spot because you ruined my life. And so this book is in a form payback for that.
Well, it felt that way. In some ways, we don't see ourselves. I have said this many times. We don't have the capacity, even when we're on Zoom and we can see our own face on the other side. We don't really see our own face without bias, without judgment. And often we literally can't see our face because we're in a world with others. We need others to see us. And the descriptions of this character, I'm like, I've often said, I feel like I'm the French meter of normalcy, which in itself is really narcissistic. But I feel very ordinary. And yet the description and the play and the engagement, as a memoir, I'll just come back to this category. As a memoir, it is a brilliant process of inviting us to that question. What does creativity call us to become? What's in the way? And the intersection of it is an incredibly creative book in that it teaches a lot about creativity without telling a lot about creativity.
Sure.
And in that, as the one-time creative director at Willow Creek Church in Chicago, you've been in big settings, and both in terms of your acting career, terms of your writing. I mean, to say the least, you're one of the most creative people I have known on the earth. And so to begin that process to say, what got in the way? I mean, we often think, let me just take another sentence, tortured artist. And you could have been called a tortured artist. And yet,
100%, of course,
the creativity process requires such, it isn't just a muse that inspires. It is a level of labor, of editing, work, editing. And we often think, I'm not creative. Well, what a brutal lie. Every human being reflects something of the creator who is creative. And what you're inviting us to is that question of what is creativity and what gets in the way? I'd love for you to put words to that.
Yeah, I mean, creativity, I think for a long time I thought was in a noun. It was a thing. You became, you were creative or you weren't creative. You had it or you didn't. Something needed to be more or less creative. And so you just added sort of the spice of creativity. And especially as a creative professional where day in and day out, that's the job, is to be creative. And I think for me, what gets in the way, Stephen Pressfield calls it resistance. People could call it any form of evil, if you wanted to go so far as to call it that. But I think in the end, what was getting in the way was me. And it was, I had yet to reconcile the things and stories and moments of my past that I continued to repeat, that continued to play out, moments that I hadn't yet come to terms or made peace with. And those stories were preventing me from being my most creative self. And so creativity, I began to sort of redefine as not a thing, but really just not just a new way of thinking, a new way of living. But again, I couldn't do that until I found myself in Seattle and until I began to I think back to our class in Faith, Hope, and Love. I actually love that I had kept some old transcripts of Faith, Hope, and Love.
I know that,
which is where I stole and copied and pasted various parts of our conversation to kind of weave the narrative together. But there is a moment in class that I think was kind of the aha moment, and I think it's maybe a better answer to your question. Is you said something to the effect of, we think of time as linear, as past, present, future, and that makes sense. But how we experience time is so much more nuanced and interesting. And in fact, some of the time is inverted. It isn't past, present, future. And in fact, it's past, future, present. And the way you described it was that take a moment of your past, a moment of trauma, a moment of pain or hurt, that occurred in the past, but we project that idea onto the future. And however then we are imagining the future is how we live in the present. And so then you said the thing that is one of your most hyperbolic statements, which it's hard to find the most hyperbolic statement of yours, but it might be this. The easiest thing to change is your past. And of course, you can't change what happened to you, but you can change the meaning. You can reinterpret what went on. And in changing your past, it begins to give you a different imagination, a new imagination, a more creative imagination for the future. And as you are imagining a different future, it allows you to live differently today. And so for me, I mean, to play it all the way back to your original question, it was my past that was preventing me from being creative.
Yeah. And I love the title, Exit the Cave. And you don't really need to know a lot about Plato. You don't need to know that it's one of his major metaphors, stories, to invite people to see that the shadows in a cave on the wall from a fire look like reality, but indeed they're not. And so, I think, though I won't say for sure, that C.S. Lewis picked up that concept and used the word shadowlands, that we live in the shadowlands, and the real versus that which is not unreal, but unsubstantial. And I think in so many ways, your story, and I don't want to tell a story other than to say your relationship with your father, the harm that you endured, became the reality when in fact it was and it was not. And so I kind of want to hear you say, how did you pick the title, and how, particularly through the book, is this intersection between the real and what's really real plays out?
Sure. Yeah. When I was 17, I grew up in Minnesota, and I remember being seated in the back of my humanities class. I must have been a junior, I believe, in high school. And our teacher told us the story of Plato's allegory of the cave. And it's exactly as you described. There's a tribe of people. They're chained to the back of the cave. They're chained to look up at the cave wall. And what they see are these shadows. And they've been there since forever. And then one day, one of the members of the tribe stands up, and the shackles fall off. And they realize that they're not chained after all, that they're free to go at any time. And they turn and they kind of see the artifice of the whole play playing out. They see the fire, they see a walkway, they see other people carrying these objects, creating the shadows. And then just beyond the fire, they see this dot of light, which calls to the man. And he moves through the cave, he passes the fire. Every step towards the light is more and more painful until eventually he gets out into the open, and he sees truth. He sees the tree. He sees the dog in the chair. And it's an incredible story of what it means to come out of the darkness and into the light and see the truth. And there's all these, wonderful metaphors, but there's a twist at the end of the story. And this is where I think I was hooked, because instead of running away from the cave, kind of as far away as the man can go, he returns. Mm-hmm. He goes back into the darkness, back to the the very recess where he began his journey, and he calls out to his tribe and he says, "There's so much more." And I remember being 17 with braces and a bowl cut, sitting in the back of this classroom, hearing that story and wanting so desperately for it to be true. Like, I wanted to believe that there was something else. I wanted to believe that there was more. And so I found myself identifying with that character in this sort of aspiration of, can I do that? And then also eventually as an artist being like, well, now I've learned some things and I can come back and I can tell you. It's a dance of linguistics and time that we don't have room in this podcast. But I had come to a place in my professional career where I thought I was doing exactly that. I was coming to the back of the cave and saying, "There's so much more," shouting in the dark places in the theaters and in the cinemas and the places where I was creating art. But at the same time, my life was falling apart. Mm-hmm. And I realized that my journey out of the cave, I'd missed a few steps. I'd maybe bypassed a few stories that then I needed to go back to. And the other formative story, well, I guess, tell me, Dan, do you want to jump into Hagar, or
I would again
do the whole thing?
Part of the joy is I'm just enjoying listening. So you take us wherever you wish.
So let's see, what's a good place to kind of jump back in? I realized that I had neglected some parts of my story. Another part of the book that is formative, and this is why it's so fun to have this conversation with you, Dan, because you really are such a character, period, and also one in my story, where later in our Faith, Hope, and Love class, you told us the story of Hagar. and essentially the Egyptian enslaved woman who becomes property of Sarah and Abraham. Sarah's unable to get pregnant, and so Abraham impregnates her, and it's a story that has it's a horrible story. It's a very challenging and difficult story. It's kind of one of the bloody, gutsy, gory stories of the Bible that we, oftentimes don't discuss. And I remember even in writing the book, asking some questions of you, like, can you take me back to that story and kind of exegeting it? And, you had no answers for me, and it was very unfortunate.
Yes.
But as hard as that story is, there are two truths that you pulled out and became sort of, if the cave had become the first formative story of Act 1, Act 2 was formed by the story of Hagar, the Egyptian slave, and the two questions that the angel of the Lord asks her at the edge of the river. So she one night breaks away from Sarah and Abraham. She, blasts through the woods and finds herself at a riverbed where the angel of the Lord appears and asks her two questions. Where have you come from, and where are you going? And I tell that story because you told that story, but it connected me back to the places that I thought that I had made peace with and realized that I had not, because where I was going was so directly connected to where I had come from. And yet I had not done the work of going back into the particularities of those moments, of those stories, so that I could actually change the past. And it was in a practicum session where I was told that I was a liar in repeating my story again and again. And they said, I don't believe you. Stop performing your story. Maybe, let us in, confess. And so again, going back to your very original, the way we started this conversation, yes, the book is a memoir. But if it borrows anything from St. Augustine, it is just a confession. And my hope in doing so is another one-liner from you, Dan, is that you can't take anyone farther than you've gone yourself. And so I knew that if I wanted to invite a space that felt safe for people to address some of the hurt and harm and pain in their own stories, that I needed to be willing to go there myself. And I guess maybe that's what it means to be an artist. I guess maybe that's what it means to be a tortured artist. But I know that as hard as it is to try and hawk a book with your deepest and darkest secrets, I do know that someone will read this and not feel alone.
Yes.
Someone will read this and say, me too. And I will say this, I do think it's important to share, Dan, because sort of memoir salvation stories of coming out of the darkness and into the light don't also stories of harm done to the author, the writer. They don't also include the hurt and the harm that they've caused along the way, which I've done a fair amount. And so I feel like that's just important to say as part of this conversation. But I do hope that people read it and they see themselves. And I always misquote Carl Sagan when I say this, but I did look it up for this interview, is that he said that the most personal is the most universal. And so I think that's given me courage as I've told my story, that as I do that, and as I've gone into the particularities, and as I've gone into those very specific moments of my story, that people would truly find themselves, that they would find the shadows that they have been stuck staring at, and that they would begin to move out of the cave and into the light, and then maybe even themselves go back and remind their own tribe that there is more.
Well, in some sense, it's the power of a group where there's engagement with story and deep heartbreaking but also hope-filled stories. It's not simple. Well, in some ways it is simple, but it is not simplistic. It isn't, I was once, now I am. It is, I once was and still am and am not and will, in one sense, be forever moving, both in and out of brokenness and beauty. But nonetheless, as I read, captured indeed by the rich and I don't know a better word, the brilliant language, taking me into things that have points of similarity, but also great differences, like good fiction. There's something I'm identifying, but not fully because I'm not the creature there. Yet it's still revelatory. It's exposing, and that confirming, exposing power that brings the reminder of goodness, even in the deepest heartache. That was a central part. And I'm wondering, like, when you think about one of the stories for you that was a shadow, that actually looked like it was more real than real, that you needed to be able to leave the cave in order to come back and encounter that story again, to be able to leave again and come back again. I wonder what comes to your mind and heart.
How I came to learn of you, Dan, was through your book, The Wounded Heart. Mm-hmm. And I read that at one of the lowest parts of my life. And I then also realized you had some weird school in Seattle. And I had no desire to go to seminary. I always wanted to go to Yale Drama School. And I ended up in fucking Seattle on the other side of the country.
In a theology
because my life
program.
Yeah. Which led me to 10 years at a mega church.
It's hilarious.
Yes, that is a word that you could use. But I read Wounded Heart, and I knew that whatever it was that was going on in Seattle, I needed more of. So the story that returns is the story of my abuse at the hands of two older boys in my neighborhood. And I'd always held that story in sort of the penultimate moment of this 3-act structure that I had created, which was my dad was an alcoholic and an addict, and my mom suffered from debilitating diabetes, and she had seizures, and my brother and I needed to care for her in different ways, and then the third sort of big twist was, and I was sexually abused as a young boy. It was telling that story again and again in practicum as part of the Seattle school that I was told in no uncertain terms that I'd been performing that 3-act structure. And it was time to kind of go back to those stories, to those shadows, because I was reenacting them in so many heartbreaking ways to myself and to others, as I realized I myself had become an addict in many of the same ways that my dad had. And as I went back into those stories, both in my work in Seattle and in the book, I realized that there was such goodness. Someone asked me in another interview if you could describe the boy in the cave and the man who still stands outside of it. I said I actually use one word, and it would be the same word for both, and it's good. The boy in the cave was good, and the man standing outside the cave is good. And as I went back into those stories of my abuse, and I recognized the goodness of the boy who was curious, the goodness of the boy who wanted care and touch and affection, and who wanted to be seen and taken delight in. It doesn't remove the harm that happened. And it's a conundrum to hold the goodness with the terrible things that happened. It's really an uncomfortable thing to hold both. But I think what you have taught me is it is all a paradox. It is always both. It is comedy, as you say, hilarious, and also tragedy.
Yes.
And so those are some of the stories that I return to. And I'll be honest, there are many places where I got stuck. And I'm so glad that as we began the interview, or before we clicked record, that you got to say hello to Margaret, my wife, who you've known for many, many years. And you say that you needed to do it in community. And it was 100% true. My wife was the greatest editor I could have ever had, in the ways that she reminded me of what I had already known, what I always knew. But even so many years later, trying to write it out, I had forgotten. I had forgotten that is the truth. That boy was good, that he was curious, that he wanted to be taken delight in. And it was like always right on the surface, but I couldn't say it until Margaret reminded me of it, which I think is, go ahead.
No, it's just the gift of her presence, just even having her face for a second is, again, the light. And again, not to say there wasn't goodness in you before she spoke, but she spoke and something came to be. There is that creative act in speech that when she spoke, existence came to be. Now, again, I'm not saying that she or any other person speaks ex nihilo, out of nothing. She's speaking to and about, yet in her creativity to see and engage, even in the midst of your failures of her and your failures of yourself.
That's right.
There was eyes to see your glory. And that, I just think of some meals that we've had together, sitting and just being able to marvel at both broken, but the light of beauty that exists between the two of you. And that just takes me again back to this question of in addressing and wrestling with great harm, the great harm actually drew you into the creative process. There was something of curiosity that opened the door. Will not step into the particulars, but into the events of the abuse. And that has been something you've been at war with for a lifetime, is your own curiosity. Yet it's also the basis of so much of the brilliance of your creativity. Again, through the book, how has that process come to a further sense of goodness?
I mean, I think that's such a great, I think that is the word. That's probably one that really does define my work, and I think any creative act is, or the turn of a phrase of a really good therapist is, get curious about that. Get curious about. I wonder why that is. And I think what I keep thinking about with regard to curiosity is, well, let me take that again. And when I think about curiosity, I do think about my story, that one I just told you about my abuse, because I didn't just name that I was curious, but I blessed it.
Yes.
And I said, as you mentioned, it is good. Or I said it, yeah, it is good. And so as I am still kind of doing the spiral dynamics of recovery, of trying to move forward, but sometimes having relapsed or where things take what feels like a backward slide, and knowing that that movement backwards does have the opportunity, if I care for those places of harm and of relapse and of hurt to myself and others. And if I bless it with curiosity, it has the potential to propel me even further forward rather than being stuck in that place. And so I think that, to me, as I am as I came to the end of the writing process, just wanting to continue to name and bless my curiosity, and how that functions as an author, as a writer, as a husband, as a dad. Like, oh gee, I wonder what's going on there with my 8-year-old child, and how have I ruined her? I wonder about that today. How did I break them today?
Oh, that's why at core we all truly need to provide some degree of help with regard to, college or trade school, or, beyond, the process of like elementary and high school. You may not be able to pay the whole thing, but you should be thinking about that on their behalf as well. You should have a therapy fund on behalf of your children.
Oh my, yeah. Well, and that does make me think of Roy Barsness, who's no longer at Seattle School, recently retired. I believe he was the one that said, "You've succeeded as a parent if your children go to therapy for different reasons than you do."
Absolutely. I hadn't heard him say that, but that really is true. But I think mine have also gone for some of the same reasons. So I won't
well, then
entirely,
you failed, Dan.
Then I won't entirely say that is an indication of failure. The fruit of curiosity, you have this phrase that's embedded, if I said curiosity and pick the verb, killed. Curiosity killed the cat. And so we know that curiosity will disrupt. And I think that's part of what a creative does. If you can simply do what I thought you were going to do, essentially I may feel confirmed in my own judgment, but in many ways I am bored. So the disruptive process, it invites, it does soothe, but it deeply disrupts.
Yeah, and being boring is the worst thing you could be called as an artist or as a creative. That's the last thing that you want to do. In the book, I tell a story about a friend of mine whose sibling had just gotten a divorce, and I said, "Well, my gosh, what did you say?" And the sibling was an artist as well, a creative person. And I said, "What did you say to him?" He said, "Gosh, you're so boring that you would have an affair. So dumb and predictable. Of course you would." And I remember feeling like I couldn't have imagined how a worse thing to, there's so many other things I would have rather been called. And for so much of my life, I was so very boring. The shadows that I was looking at, the shadows that I was making, they were so utterly boring. My addiction was so boring. Trying to remain sober and be in recovery is the absolute antithesis of that. Being committed in a relationship to community and to my partner, that's fucking hard, and that's really scary, and that is not boring at all. But for so long, I thought that's the boring thing. That it was meant to restrain me, but in fact, it's there to set me free.
Well, the notion of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, there is wildness. There is the turn out of the conformity, the dogmatism, the status quo. And then you realize that at core levels, all flights from a deeper reality, not a return to the status quo, but to the deeper reality of the heartbeat of God, opens the door to a new level of life. Like, again, I won't go into details, but yesterday was not a good day for my marriage. And our fighting, our engagement, my failure, her failure, it was a shit show. And today, even though we didn't go to bed just totally in chaos, just getting up this morning and looking at one another with a kind of, what do we do with this proverbial hangover from what occurred?
Sure.
How do we come back? How do we honor that we're both hurt and we both hurt each other? And there's something more. We just can't pretend it's over. We can't just go back and try and rehash. And in that sense of the newness of redemption, the newness of what is now being called forth into, even though I talk a lot, have a lot of words, in those moments,
Dan.
in those moments to be able to go, I don't know what to say, but I need to speak.
Sure.
And how do we come not just back together, but how do we come back together forward in a way in which we are able to stand on the neck of evil and say, our love can grow even stronger in the midst of this. It is hard.
It's so hard. It's so hard. And it is, and I don't think there's anything more creative than that.
Mm-hmm.
That is the opposite of boring, of predictable, of staying stuck in the pattern, and trying something new, experimenting with something new, shutting your damn mouth, Dan, for just a goddamn minute.
Indeed. And it may not be the exact words Becky spoke, but it was the energy. It was the energy and the invitation to, when you don't have words, will you start listening, not just to what's inside, but what your partner is inviting you to hear about, not just your failure, but about what was happening for her in the midst. So in some ways, it could have been eventually a good drama. It could have been, I mean, if this had been, and grateful it wasn't, videotaped, it's where you go, it's the kind of authenticity that you seldom see in films or certainly in Christian creatives. So before we end, I just want, we've poked into a lot of places. How do you bring this into a community, into the people of God, in a way in which, because you did manage and create on behalf of Willow Creek conversations that wouldn't have occurred without what you were doing on the stage and what you were doing with music, what you were doing with the stage itself as the place to reveal the stage of life itself?
I mean, I kind of go back to the earlier part of our conversation when we were discussing Hagar. The Bible is filled with the most incredible stories of blood and guts and gore and pain and trauma, and goodness and curiosity and beauty and hope. I think that because I maybe grew up Catholic, I didn't have any of these sort of evangelical baggage in when I began my tenure at Willow Creek, and because I had been a secular artist before I had, finally done the good thing and given my working hours to the Lord and started making sacred art. I think because my perspective was so very different, in many ways, it was relatively easy for me, because the goal for me was just to try to tell the truth, and knowing that if we were going to invite people, at the end of this time, in a church service, to give their life to Christ and be changed and renewed and have some form of healing, I felt like it was a disservice to do that without inviting them first into a taste of what it might actually look like. And so for me, that was the complexity of my story. And so that's what I offered again and again and again, which is, it's unfortunate it took me 4 to 5 years to realize that's how I needed to write the book. But thank God for, Meredith, my writing coach,
yes,
who allowed me the space to do that. But but I think that's how I did it. I think I had great source material, both the Bible and my own. To be able
and the
to
lives of others around you. So given that, I come back to this phrase as we end, and that is, in telling the truth, you've done so beautifully, but not because you've made our brokenness beautiful, but because in that brokenness, there is something of the presence of God. We go to darkness. We go to darkness because that's where light is found. God is in the presence of darkness. And if we'll go to that in ourselves and in our lives with others, the surprising presence of the goodness of God will show God's self to us in a way that dissipates despair. And I think that's the gift of what your book brings. As I finished the book for the very first time, I literally just stood up. I remember looking at Becky and I just said, and God is good. Mm-hmm. And if that can be some, well, probably not the totality, but if that can be the basis of how people read your confession, this will become a classic. And I am blushing but honored to be a part not only of the book, but your life. My friend, it has been good to be with you.
It has been good. Thank you so much, Dan.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.